本日はご多忙のところ戸田記念国際平和研究所主催公開セミナーにご来場いただき誠にありがとうございます。ここで注意事項を申し上げます。本日のセミナーの模様はライブ配信するとともに後日弊社ウェブサイトに掲載するため後方のカメラで動画撮影を行っております。お席をお立ちになる際はご注意いただけますようお願いいたします。本日のセミナーは英語で行われます。同時通訳をご希望の方はお手元のレシーバーをご利用ください。日本語通訳はチャンネル1、英語通訳はチャンネル2となります。前半のプレゼン2台の後と後半のプレゼン3台の後に質疑応答の時間を設けております。同時通訳をいたしますので、日英どちらの言語でご質問いただいても結構です。同時通訳の関係上、ご質問される方にはマイクをお持ちしますので、必ずマイクを通して質問をお願いいたします。休憩時間に会場後方にコーヒーおよびお水をご用意させていただきますので、ご自由にお召し上がりください。なお、廊下での飲食は禁止となっておりますので、場内でのご利用をお願いいたします。最後に座席についてのお願いです。この後も公開セミナーにご来場される方がいらっしゃいます。より多くの皆様にご着席いただくため、お席は空席がないよう詰めてご着席をお願いいたします。注意事項と本日のプログラムはお手元の資料をご確認ください。それでは開会まで今しばらくお待ちください。Thank you very much for taking the time to attend today's public seminar hosted by the Toda Peace Institute. The information I have just announced is also provided in English on the handout that has been placed on your table. We kindly request that you take a moment to read it. The seminar will begin shortly. Thank you for your patience.
Konnichiwa. My name is Kevin Clements. I'm the director of the Toda Peace Institute, and it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all here to this workshop on building peace in an unpredictable world, the global implications of Trump 2. I can't think of a moment in my lifetime when I felt more insecure and more worried and anxious about international relations and the state of the world than I am today. So I think that this workshop that we're putting on, which will feature senior research fellows from the Institute and myself, is very timely indeed. And I look forward to an interactive session with all of you in the Q&A periods. I would like to welcome members of the Diplomatic Corps, members of academia, the Women's Committee and Great Force, and other members of civil society and so forth. I'm very pleased that you're all here. So I was given the task of writing on the state of the world, and I have to say it's extremely challenging. I can explain it all a little bit in terms of just a series of words. I mean, it's turbulent, it's chaotic, it's unpredictable, it's anarchic, autocratic, unpeaceful, inhumane, unjust and unequal, environmentally challenged, inadequate political leadership, declining optimism, coercive, unsustainable, unbridled power, nationalism, populism, polarization, declining multilateralism, violent state-based armed conflict, geoeconomic confrontation, and growing pessimism, and I could go on. These are just a few of the words that I think sum up the state of play at the moment. We're not living in an ordered, rules-based order anymore. We're living in an age of considerable uncertainty. I thought as I was preparing this that I would start off with the risk assessment that the elites were using at Davos just a couple of weeks ago. Each year they prepare a little, quite a large publication on the current global risk landscape. And I thought I would just start with that to show you the top 5 or 6 issues which are worrying the world's global leaders and academia and the experts who compiled this report. The first and obvious one is state-based armed conflict. All of the people that were compiling this report can't recall a moment when there's been so much state-based armed conflict, with the devastating consequences that we know will follow from that. Extreme weather events comes in at number 2, which should encourage political leaders and others to really, really take climate change much more seriously. And the fact that on the very first day of President Trump's presidency, he withdrew the United States from the Paris Accords doesn't augur well in terms of dealing with global climate change and environmental catastrophe. Geoeconomic confrontation was the third. And that is something else, I think, which has become much sharper. And you can see the way in which it's been used over the past few days, as Trump, first of all, put tariffs on Mexico and on Canada and on China, then withdrew them from Mexico when they obeyed his requests, and postponed them on Canada, but kept them on China. So you can see that this geoeconomic confrontation and the weaponization of trade is something which I think is going to become very challenging for all of us. And you'll see as number 4 there, misinformation and disinformation. This is becoming a kind of a major issue in relation to not only fake news, but the use of artificial intelligence and other things to influence political parties, political elections, decision-making generally. And so that's something else which comes in. And then number 5, I think, is societal polarization. I can't recall a moment in my life when there's been so much division in so many different societies. Australia and New Zealand, where I come from, for example, is deeply polarized. The United States is deeply polarized. Germany and France are deeply polarized. You're very fortunate here in Japan that I would have to say that you're one of the more integrated and less polarized countries of the world. And then economic downturn is the next, and then critical change to Earth systems. But those I think are very accurate risk assessments. They're something that we do need to take seriously. We've got to put them on the agenda all the time for thinking through what kind of political project we want to support. And the World Economic Forum put this into a global risk landscape, which in a sense is a kind of a schematic outline of the way in which all of these different issue areas are connected. So we talked last year about the polycrisis. This is the polycrisis mapped out for you in schematic form. And the large dots are the dots which show how extreme the situation is. So we basically extreme inequality, decline in health and well-being, involuntary migration and displacement, economic downturn, misinformation and disinformation, interstate violence, biodiversity loss, and so forth. So this is what is particularly challenging to decision makers these days, because when they address one problem and say, well, growth is the answer, they suddenly discover that health infrastructure is disintegrating before their very eyes. So we have to begin thinking of ways in which we can address these problems sequentially and in the order of priority. I'm on the board of the Global Peace Index. Oh, that's funny. Sorry, I should go back to one. The Global Peace Index. And last year we found that the world is less peaceful than it was in 2008. There's a growing gap between the most and least peaceful countries. The number of conflicts in the world increased to 56 in 2024. From the small number of the 1980s and 90s, we're now at 56 major armed conflicts around the world. The number of countries involved in conflicts increased their borders to 92, and outside their borders increased to 92 in 2024, the highest since the Global Peace Index's inception. And military spending increased at its fastest rate since the GPI's inception. Total military expenditure last year, global military expenditure reached $2,443 billion in 2023, an increase of 6.8% in real terms from 2022. And this was the steepest year-on-year increase since 2009. And the 10 largest spenders in the world, led by the US, China, and Russia, all increased their military spending according to new data from Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. The economic impact is enormous. The global economic impact of violence in 2023 was $19.1 trillion. That's $19.1 trillion worth of lost expenditure, lost opportunity costs, and revenues which could have gone very well into helping us resolve our health crises, our education crises, and the environmental crisis. And in terms of levels of peacefulness, we haven't seen this on the index for many years. 97 countries deteriorated in peacefulness in 2024, more than any other year. And this year, as you know, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists moved the doomsday clock from 90 seconds to midnight to 89. So nuclear risk has gone higher than it has ever been before. It's good to be reminded from the Russell Einstein Manifesto that we should remember our humanity and forget the rest. This was originally a call for peace and the non-use of nuclear weapons, and it's a reminder that people should prioritize their common humanity, even over their loyalties to family, community, or nation. And that injunction gave rise to global humanitarianism. It's odd to think, oh, I've got 3 minutes left. Okay. Anyway, the whole point of that is the humanitarian project is under threat and under assault everywhere, with thousands of medical and aid workers being killed over the past 5 years. And we've forgotten our humanity in Ukraine, in the Sudan, and the Middle East, and in the other 53 ongoing wars. I just have to skip through these slides then. The 3 major conflicts, which are all proving to be quite intractable, are Israel-Palestine. That's resulted in 46,000 Palestinian deaths, 1,200 Israeli deaths, and a dire humanitarian crisis. 13,319 children killed. Ukraine is showing no sign of abatement and ceasefire negotiations in a nasty stalemate. And Sudan's civil war between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces has created another humanitarian catastrophe with thousands killed and over 1 million displaced. So there's little prospects of these easy resolution. The United Nations and regional organizations are being marginalized and gutted by Russia and the United States under Trump. The prospects for peace in those countries are bleak. While ceasefires and diplomatic efforts offer glimmers of hope, lasting resolutions remain elusive. And the international community's role in addressing these crises will be critical, but current dynamics suggest that reactive conflict management rather than resolution and transformation will define the year ahead. I just want to put this up here, just go to the 3rd paragraph to demonstrate that world's inequality is worsening. According to the World Bank, the number of people living in poverty has barely changed since 1990. The number of people living under the World Bank poverty line of $6.85 per day is close to 3.6 billion people, or 44% of the world's population. We can't sustain this extreme inequality. It's worse than France was before the French Revolution. 3.6 billion people lack dignity and power and grasp at populist strolls to try and change their condition. I think I'd better skip these. The US-China rivalry and economic decoupling, you've got it in your handouts there. The Global South is increasingly asserting itself in international affairs through the Belt and Road Initiative, the expansion of BRICS and so forth. But what we're seeing is that technological superiority, particularly in AI, is becoming a key battleground for geopolitical dominance. And when China launched its DeepSeek program, I mean, you could see what an impact that was on American high tech. So this is a battleground. It's not just a sector which is rapidly developing and showing us faster and more efficient ways of doing things. It is at the heart of the struggle between those who are in economic competition with each other. Climate change remains a critical issue. With 2025, expect to see more frequent and severe weather events. We're moving to a multipolar order with power dispersed among multiple nations and blocs, and that's leading to a global governance vacuum. The 80th anniversary of the UN this year highlights the need for reforms, so that the UN might become more effective in the fields of security, climate change, and peaceful resolution of disputes. The rise of far-right politics in Europe and elsewhere, along with political polarization in the US, are undermining democratic institutions, and nowhere is this more clearly seen than in the United States right now. Commentators like Timothy Snyder, who are not given to hyperbole, are talking about a constitutional coup taking place even as we speak. This is in the United States, which used to be the bastion of democracy, the light on the hill. It's now finding that its own sovereignty and respect for the Constitution is under severe attack. The ending of USAID is generating challenges everywhere. All payments have been stopped to USAID programs. That means in Kenya, for example, as my colleague Lisa Schirch highlighted yesterday, that 7,000 USAID employees, local employees, have now just suddenly lost their jobs. So national actions are having grave international consequences. So we've got heightened competition, fragmentation, uncertainty, interplay of tech advances, global economy expected to grow at 2.7%, which is not enough to satisfy all the needs of all our countries. Global temperatures are expected to rise, leading to more frequent and severe weather events. Water scarcity and competition for critical minerals like lithium and cobalt will intensify. And addressing these challenges are going to require creativity, innovative diplomacy, inclusive governance, and a renewed commitment to multilateralism. Most important, though, are the millions of individuals, groups, and organizations and communities represented by all of you here, working out how we can remain optimistic in the face of these challenges and how to assert the power of civil society to ensure high levels of political accountability and empathetic and compassionate politics. 1 minute left, so that gives me a chance to read the poem by Seamus Heaney, which is optimistic. Human beings suffer, he said, they torture one another, they get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endure. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells, and believe in your own power and capacity as we resist the things we know to be truly evil. Thanks very much. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our Senior Research Fellow, Stein Tønnesson, who will be talking about reassurance and deterrence.
Press this button forward, and you want to go back.
It's not too late to prevent the Third World War. We are well on the way, but it's not too late. And what the world needs, I would say, is reassurance. And I've taken the definition of reassurance here from ChatGPT. I think it's a satisfactory definition. And the need for reassurance is particularly acute for all the reasons that Kevin Clements has just explained to you. And my list of all the bad things that are happening in the world today is here. Not all of them, but all the ones that I could include on one template. But I want to remind you about what I say down on the right-hand side, and that is that this region, East Asia, remains peaceful in the sense that there is not war between states yet. And this peace has lasted for more than 40 years. The last war in East Asia was between China and Vietnam in 1979. This is a great achievement, and it is due partly to reassurance. So what can one do to preserve that peace? That's my question. When we hear strategists and politicians talk today about strategic affairs, they talk a lot about deterrence, and they sometimes also talk about compellence. Deterrence means to prevent someone from doing something that you don't want them to do, or coerce it. And compellence means to make them do something they don't want to do, but you want them to do. What I am going to argue now is that you cannot make deterrence or compellence work unless you match it with reassurance. Because if you try to deter by building as many arms as possible, the other one will build arms as well. And it will lead to what is called the security dilemma, where both parties fear the other, and at some point the war breaks out. But if you match deterrence with reassurance, it may work. The one who said this very clearly in a classic work is the winner of the Nobel Prize, Thomas Schelling, in his book Arms and Influence from 1966, where he makes the point that if you want to prevent someone from entering the door and you point a gun and you say, if you enter, I will shoot you, then that also means that if he or she does not enter, you will not shoot. So there must be promises inherent in deterrence for it to work. In addition, reassurance leads out of the need for deterrence and can provide the way for peace building, for confidence building, and for cooperation. In East Asia, there are certain crisis zones, and I will just mention first here Taiwan, because Taiwan is a specifically acute situation. And for a long time, all the time since the rapprochement between China and the United States in the 1970s, Taiwan has been the subject to a US policy that I call double deterrence. It's also sometimes called strategic ambiguity. The double deterrence means that the United States is on the one hand deterring Taiwan from declaring itself independent, and on the other hand deterring China from using force against Taiwan. And each of those two deterrences are at the same time reassurance of the other, because by deterring China from using force, the United States reassures Taiwan. And by deterring Taiwan from going independent, it reassures China from something that obliges China to use force in a law from 2005. This is a complex and unsatisfactory situation around Taiwan, but it's the best there is, because it guarantees a kind of status quo which has allowed Taiwan and mainland China to build a very strong economies and welfare in their two countries. Here I put up some of the aims of reassurance, where I distinguish between the immediate needs for reassurance, which is mainly conflict prevention, and the more long-term aims, which are to lead towards a cooperative world. We could talk much about that cooperative world before, and we should do it still, but it's not immediately on the cards. As far as I'm concerned, I think that the immediate thing is to avoid the worst to happen. We need to build competence and knowledge about the various kinds of reassurance that are available to policymakers. And at a time when you have the kind of mutual suspicion that you have in the world today, in this volatile world, there is mainly a need for unilateral initiatives, reassuring the initiatives, because it's not really possible to agree between adversaries. So what you need are these unilateral initiatives, restraint, various goodwill offers, declarations of intent. Transparency is extremely important, and then invitations to start cooperation. And then in the longer term, you can have more bilateral and multilateral cooperative reassurances. There are examples in history that we can study, a lot of examples from the Cold War, of how one part or one state in the Cold War reassured the other, although there was acute adversity between them. Here's just a list of some of the very many examples that it can possibly study. I also want to mention some examples of Chinese restraint in Southeast Asia, which are slightly reassuring, but are normally seen as very provocative. And here I want to emphasize that in the South China Sea, China has not used armed force to shoot since 1988. Despite all it does with the Philippines and with Vietnam, it has not opened fire. And when it has conducted military exercises around Taiwan, it has warned people in advance by putting out maps of where they are going to be. They have crossed the median line in the Taiwan Strait, but they have not crossed into Taiwan's territorial sea. So there is certain limits to what they have done, and that are meant to also to prevent it from leading directly to war. And it has also refrained from intervening militarily in other countries, and here the place where it's most tempting to intervene is in Myanmar, because China has such great plans for Myanmar, for transportation corridor down to the Bay of Bengal. But so far, China has been reticent. It is mediating between forces inside Myanmar, but it's not intervening militarily. We should, to some extent, appreciate this, even though we see China as assertive. And I also want to mention one initiative, in fact, taken by President Donald Trump. At the moment, most people don't say anything positive about President Trump, and I don't want normally to do it either. But I want to honor him for one thing, which was that he canceled military exercises near North Korea in order to get closer to Kim Jong-un in 2018. And that worked wonderfully, except that the whole negotiation broke down afterwards. But also Trump can reassure. Skeptics have a tendency, when I speak about reassurance, to say that it doesn't work because it doesn't change the adversary's behavior. And they sometimes say that it's like pouring water into a bottomless bucket. But this points out that if you are the target of reassurance, if you see that your adversary reassures you in some way, a very wise choice is to respond with a reassuring measure yourself. So there will be reassurance from both sides. In my conclusion is that reassurance plays a vital role in maintaining peace and stability in international relations, and particularly in situations like those that we have today. So what the world really needs now is reassurance and cooperation. And I would call on civil society organizations, diplomatic academies, foreign affairs ministries, UN agencies, that they all study the history of reassurance and how it has prevented war in the past, and build repertoires of appropriate measures for various contingencies. This should be part of the toolbox in every foreign ministry. And the Toda Peace Institute will do its best to help. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stein. And next we have Olivia Stokes, Dreier, who's going to talk about global democracy.
So I actually changed the title of my presentation. It was, "Can democracy survive the polarizing forces of our times?" But is this the most recent that we have up, Nobu? This is what I changed it to. Thank you. So I put that title up before Trump was elected. And things have moved very quickly in the last few weeks, as you well know. So I changed it to "From Polarization to Domination, the Battle for Democracy in a Fast-Changing World." And I have to say that I'm an American. It's with great humility that I speak to you on this subject of global challenges to democracy, because I feel right now the US is the biggest threat to democracy in the world, which is very concerning. But before I talk about what happened in the US or in these last few weeks, I do want to look at the world at large, because we can focus too much on America, and we shouldn't do that. So 2024 was a massive year for elections worldwide. There were some elections in something like 70 countries. Half the world's population had elections. Some 2 billion people voted, and many said that this year of so many elections would be a real test for democracy. So what were some of the takeaways from that year? Average voter turnout actually rose for the first time in 20 years, so that is a good thing. Interestingly, incumbents, those who already had power, largely lost, whether they were to the left or to the right. And it's the first time in the West that every single governing party lost vote share. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction with how governments are operating. That is one takeaway. And I think the third is we can see a lot of disillusionment with democracy. A recent survey in the US said that 50% of people do not believe that democracy serves their interests. So this is a real concern. There were some strong displays of popular will for democracy. I'll just give two quick examples. In Senegal, pre-election protests led to the release of the major opposition leader from prison. And he went on, he was 44 years old, went on to have a sweeping victory. So it's a case where public pressure really affected things and led to a more free and fair election. He was not imprisoned for any good reason. In Bangladesh, as many of you know, Prime Minister Hasina, who was running for a 5th term, declared herself winner. There were massive protests. She ended up fleeing the country. Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus now leads an interim government. But there's a lot of struggles. It is very difficult to recover democracy once it's really been undermined. So how that will go, we don't yet know. We also saw a lot of suppression and new forms of interference. In Tunisia, which was the birthplace of the Arab Spring, democracy has largely been snuffed out, really destroyed. Pretty much all the opposition candidates were jailed. In Venezuela, the President Maduro promised a free election. This was actually in exchange for the US agreeing to lift sanctions to allow Chevron, the oil company, to pump and export oil. But he basically declared, it was very clear that Edmundo Gonzalez won, but Maduro refused to concede, and Gonzalez ended up fleeing to Spain for his safety. And then in the US, which I fear might becoming a trendsetter in what we don't want to see, there was a lot of problems. There was increased disinformation right before the election, much of which was linked to foreign interference. There was evidence of interference from both Russia and Iran right on the eve of the election in so-called swing states in the US. There was a lot of efforts at voter suppression, at getting people off the voter rolls, particularly marginalized group, Blacks and Latinos, in states where there was fear that they would go Democratic. And as you know, Elon Musk played a huge role. He donated $200 million to Trump's campaign, obviously with his own interests in mind. Jeff Bezos of Amazon fame owns the Washington Post, one of our major newspapers. He would not allow them to endorse Kamala Harris. Traditionally, newspapers in the US are free to endorse a political candidate. They withdrew the endorsement. So this influence of billionaires is very concerning, particularly in the US, though I have to say we see it in India as well. So looking more globally, and this is from what's known as the V-Dem Liberal Democracy Index, which is the most respected of the democracy indices in the world. They have some 71 indicators for democracy. A few examples are guarantee of individual liberties, checks on power of state institutions, fair election, freedom of expression and association. So it's a very thorough list. And what's very striking is that since 2009, on all these factors, democracy has been declining. So this graph, it's separated out according to different regions of the world, but the blue line is sort of aggregate of what we see in the world at large. And you can see since 2009, this ongoing decline. Some 71% of the world's population now live in autocracies. Some of them are so-called electoral autocracies, where a president is voted, but not in a free and fair election. And 42 countries are in the process of going more autocratic. 18, according to this index, is moving more towards democracy, but the shift in the last, since 2009 is really huge. I think back in 2009, it was just the opposite. 70% of the world or so were living in democracies. We do see a few counterexamples. Brazil is trying to recover from Bolsonaro, from their autocracy. We see efforts to recover in Poland, Bangladesh, I mentioned. But as I said earlier, once democracy is undermined, it's unfortunately very difficult to get it back. I just wanted to show you one more example of one of these indexes, because I thought they have many different ones. You can find it on their website if you're interested. This one looks at deliberative aspects of democracy. How are decisions being reached? They look at things like consultation and citizen engagement, respect for counter-arguments. Is there room to debate? Is there a focus on common good? Again, if you look at that blue line, we see the sharp decline since 2009, that the space for deliberation is really shrinking. So that's another concern. One of the things that we're looking at in Global Challenges to Democracy at TODA is trying to understand all the many factors. This is a little bit like the diagram that Kevin showed you earlier, that are interacting and contributing with each other to lead to this decline in democracy. So I'm not going to take you through it, but that was just to give you a sense. But so many trends. It includes definitely growing inequality, which Kevin mentioned. The richest 1% of the world now own close to half of the world's wealth. The wealth of billionaires grew 3 times faster last year than the year before. And we're seeing this influence of wealth in elections, certainly in the US this last election. Other factors, there's so many, but to list a few, include mass migration, the kind of xenophobia that brings about, fears around immigration, people losing their sense of identity, cultural identity, mass migration due to climate change, due to unemployment, vast unemployment in so many parts of the world, particularly for youth. Violent conflict, Kevin mentioned how many violent conflicts there are right now in the world. Gang violence, polarization exacerbated by social media, and the list goes on. So what I would say is these trends have been building up gradually, and what we've seen in many places in the world where democracy is eroding, that there's this gradual erosion. In the US, it's been very sudden. We had this really explosive first 3 weeks of Donald Trump's presidency. There was some 100 executive orders that he signed in his very first week. We're all losing track of them, and that was intentional. Many of them are illegal. They're against our Constitution. But it's going to take a long time to challenge them in the courts. And this feels like a very deliberate strategy. So there were some 17 on immigration, declaring an invasion at our southern border, which allows for military intervention, mass deportations, trying to end birthright citizenship, which is for decades been the case in the US, that if you're born in the US, we are a country of immigrants, you can get citizenship. He's trying to, so in our Constitution, but he signed an executive order trying to end it. Kevin mentioned this effort to end US foreign aid. The list goes on. Withdrawal from the Paris agreements, withdrawal from the World Health Organization, the pardoning of 1,600 rioters charged for January 6th invasions of our capital, who were imprisoned, many for violent crimes against police, all pardoned. Firing inspector generals who are the sort of watchdogs at federal agencies. Again, this is illegal. You're supposed to give rationale. You're supposed to give Congress 30 days notice, but just fired. And, you know, there's a lot now, of course, happening with Elon Musk, and you've heard about his so-called DOGE, the Office of Government Efficiency, just trying to gut our federal civil service. So very worrying. Again, this can be pushed back in the courts, but it will take time. So we are seeing resistance to these efforts, and that's important. I know this went viral on social media. So the woman on the left up there is an Episcopal priest at the Washington Cathedral. And she was leading the traditional church service the day after the inauguration. And she looked directly at President Trump and urged him sort of out of his religious faith to show mercy for the hundreds and thousands of people who were extremely frightened, including immigrants, including children who were afraid that their parents would be deported, including asylum seekers who are in the country legally. So this was a real moment. Trump did not look happy when she looked at him and delivered this, but it was a moment afterwards. I think it was the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops came out with a similar statement, and other religious leaders did as well. Legal challenges have begun. There have been various court filings around many of these executive orders, but again, this is going to take time. A lot can happen from the state and local government. We are a federal system, so states have certain powers. So I think everybody's caught off guard by the quantity of things that were pushed through in the first 3 weeks. But they're trying to think through what can be challenged, where do they have some autonomy to push back. And there's a lot of civil society action unfolding. There's something called Democracy Network, which is a alliance of 350 legal organizations that are coordinating around legal efforts. There's a lot of NGOs who work around immigration issues, trying to organize. So a lot of effort is happening, and that's important. But I think what I find most worrying is that we're seeing in the US this alliance of autocracy and oligarchy, and that The tech billionaires have sort of cozied up to Trump. This was the cover of a recent magazine in the US, The New Yorker, and this was on the week of Trump's inauguration, and you see there's Elon Musk taking the oath of office, and Trump is sort of barely visible off to the side. And we saw this with Facebook as well, with Zuckerberg deciding we don't need fact checkers anymore. Clearly, Trump's proposed fiscal policies are only going to benefit the wealthy. All the promises he made to working class people who have grievances, who feel that they've suffered, are not going to happen. But his whole fiscal policy is really aimed at the wealthy. And the conflicts of interest and rampant signs of corruption are very, very worrying. I mean, Elon Musk, for example, has these huge government contracts, and yet he wasn't elected to any office, he wasn't appointed by our Congress, but he's having this just enormous influence. So the big question is, what will be the impact of what I'm calling an imperial Trump on the world stage? This is him speaking to the World Economic Forum in Davos on this huge screen, and you see these world political leaders and business leaders looking somewhat small underneath him. And he's good at being a bully. So I think it's going to be very, very important that world leaders, of course, they have their own country's interests in mind, and they have to be careful. We can understand that. But it's going to be really important that people feel they can stand up to him. And we definitely feel the same thing with our elected officials, with our Congress and Senate, to not allow Trump to sort of bully his way through. So to end on a more hopeful note, at Global Challenges to Democracy last June, we launched something it's a web platform that we're calling the Democracy Lighthouse. This is not in your handout. I just thought to add it later, but you can find it online if you Google. And because there are democracy institutes all over the world working on democracy. And we now have 300 listed across the globe, and our next effort is going to be to start to get content from them about new things they're trying to advocate for democracy, to promote democracy, and to create some kind of exchange so that it can feel like a bit of a movement, that we feel this decline, this erosion of democracy, of Trump sort of taking center stage in the world, but all the more important that we recognize that there are so many good efforts around the world. So I did want to end on that hopeful note. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. I think we've got off to a roaring start here. We don't want to just lecture you. We want this to be a kind of an opportunity for a dialogue and an exchange of ideas and worries and concerns. As I mentioned in my brief introduction, we've just been having a strategic planning session of the Toda Peace Institute. And I've never encountered such kind of collective depression among people who are normally very optimistic. And I think that all around the world at the moment, individuals are feeling just overwhelmed by everything that's happening. So feel free to share your feelings about what's happening. You don't need to ask questions. You can just say, I'm worried, because I think if we share that, then we might be able to begin discerning ways in which we can work together to provide resistance in a more progressive direction. So open for questions and comments. I think Nob is going to run around with microphone so that you can be recorded.
Thank you very much for your intriguing and informative and also thought-provoking talks. I'm Tessa Tetsuko Watanabe from Soka University, and I'd like to ask Professor Dreier about the declining of democracy index. Well, the democracy index started to decline sharply worldwide since 2009. And actually, I couldn't recall the specific events what happened or influenced the sharp declining in 2009. So were there any sort of specific events? And well, if there's a chance to rise up the democracy index rise up once again. So what sort of elements would you think need to rise once again?
It's a very good question. I don't know of any single event that happened around 2009 that caused that beginning decline. But that's, if you look at that graph, you'll see it was sort of steady for a while, and then it's sort of a gradual decline. And that's why we created that map with all these interactive factors of, you know, migration, there was the pandemic, there was growing inequality that Kevin spoke about. And I think if you looked at the VDEM, you'll find listings, analysis, and listings of factors. But I think it's a combination of so many different factors. But I also, one thing I've been thinking about recently is that in the US at least, I don't feel that people understand anymore the value of democracy, like the sense that democracy isn't working, it's not meeting 21st century challenges. There's a lot of anxiety. I think we know historically that when there's a lot of fear and anxiety, that's when people look to sort of what I would call strongman leaders, who they think will solve all their problems, that it's really all the immigrants' fault or it's this group's fault. We're going to make America great again, you know, that kind of talk. And people want that kind of reassurance. So I think that's one thing. I was sharing with my colleagues, I saw a recent survey in the UK of young people, teenage through 20s, and more than half thought that the UK might be better off as a dictatorship. I was shocked. And so I think a lot of it is education. Like, young people need to understand what the value of democracy is. And of course, in the UK, these are people who've grown up in democracy, so they don't know what it would be like to actually live under a dictatorship, what they might lose.
Thank you. Stein, do you want to say something?
I just want to add that this statistic that you show where the decline from 2009 is the inverse of the statistic of armed conflict. Because 2009 is also the turning point there, where we had a long period of less war in the world, where we thought that were about to overcome the problem of war. The most optimistic peace researchers has changed, and now there is more armed conflict than ever.
Interesting.
Yeah. Other questions and comments? Yes, Taka.
Thank you, Kevin. I must first thank all the presenters for the, how should I put it, an insightful presentations. The question I have is about universities and also the media. I hear a lot about people becoming quiet about discussing the situation in Gaza. Those who come out with more straightforward, if I may say, comments about what's going on there, they tend to be quietened somehow. Maybe it's because of the SNSs, or maybe it's because of their superiors making them be quiet about it. I'm particularly worried about the situation in not only in the US. I mean, I believe that one of the reasons why Kamala lost is she disappointed the young people by not mentioning straightforwardly, not criticizing what her government has been doing to, how should I say, the Ukrainian situation and also the Palestinian, what's a good word for it?
Yeah.
Nakba. Anyway, I'm also very much worried about what's going on in Europe. Great change. Because of Ukraine, Sweden has become a member of NATO. Finland. Weren't there much debate within those countries? What I hear is that the people who are against the government joining NATO has been kind of quietened. I mean, please enlighten us on what's going on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Taka. We've got. Why don't you go first on militarism and NATO, and then Olivia on the universities.
I'm Norwegian. I live in Oslo, Norway, and Norway has long been a member of NATO. I discussed with my Swedish colleagues, and I noticed approximately what you said, that they were very unhappy about joining NATO. Many people, at least people who were social democrats or on the left. But there was at the same time a massive feeling of a need for protection and a fear of Russia. I felt it myself. The streets have changed, the languages spoken on the streets have changed. We have a lot, you hear Ukrainian language from refugees all the time. I personally must say that I was also in favor of Sweden and Finland joining us in NATO. So we will have a Nordic community within NATO. And it's fortunately, these are democratic nations still. The Gaza thing, I also from the perspective of Norwegian, I don't recognize really the silence, because there has been an enormous rage in the Norwegian population against the massacre on the Palestinians in Gaza, and constant demonstrations in the streets with many Palestinians participating, and also criticism of Hamas' violent action against Israel. So these are just from one corner of the world. It differs from country to country, I know.
Thank you, Olivia.
Yeah, I think you're right that one of the things that contributed to Kamala's loss was that she couldn't speak out on Gaza. But of course, she was still vice president. She was still supporting Biden while she was running. So she was constrained. But I can give you an example. One of my sons said to me, "I'm not voting. There's no way I can vote for somebody who I feel is perpetrating genocide." And I don't think he voted, as far as I know. So I think that's a real issue. It was very contentious on university campuses. The US has had such a problem with anti-Semitism, so it's very complicated. But I think for many Americans, they do see it as a genocide. So that's been complicated. But I think also, I agree with you that there's a kind of silence on universities, and it's worrying. And right now, too, that Trump is threatening to cut off federal grants. Universities in the US depend a lot for research on federal grants. If they're doing anything to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, that just, and that has been written into any grant, because it used to be required. Whether you were doing science or whether you were doing the arts, you were required for a federal grant to say in what way, what efforts were you making to be inclusive. But now, yeah, so universities are scared, and that's a dangerous sign. Too many newspapers have settled lawsuits out of court because Trump was suing for whatever they had said during the campaign. And rather than go to court, they settled. It was easier for them to pay. Our public radio, public TV is being threatened with funds being withdrawn. So these are all worrying signs. And I think one of the ways that autocracy gains is by that kind of silencing.
It's extremely worrying when universities, which are supposed to be the critic and conscience of society, decide that it's, for a whole variety of reasons, that it's prudent to remain silent, because silence ends up creating a permissive environment for Trump and his agenda. Any other comments and questions? Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing the anxiety that we're all feeling and for creating the space to talk about it. My name is Ashima. I work with the Soka Gakkai Office of Public Information. And I think it's shockingly the time for women's rights has in America is it's shockingly difficult right now, and people that are from the LGBTQIA communities, I can just imagine the psychological impact that these laws are having on young people or people in not just in America but across the world. And with the U.S. aid being stopped, I mean, there are so many countries in the global south that are also suffering from the lack of this aid. So especially women in conflict areas. So from that gendered perspective, I'm just wondering, what direction can civil society take to counter this? What kind of support can we do on the grassroots level to support women and people from the LGBTQIA communities to feel like they have the right to live and the right to their identity, and even those that want to have children, that they will be protected somehow?
No, it's such an important question. And actually, the Episcopal priest also mentioned that in her words to Trump, which was brave of her. Because as you know, Trump is basically saying there are only two genders, male and female, and it's not okay to put other on any government document or anything like that. So that fear is really there. There's a very macho quality to it, of sort of Trump's administration and kind of coming in and, sort of tearing things down, and we're going to recreate. I think it's going to take us all time to sort of take some deep breaths, to sort of think about strategies, what's going to be effective. But absolutely, the impact of withdrawing U.S. aid around the world, as Lisa, you were saying the other day, it's basically the richest man in the world endangering the lives of the world's poorest. I mean, it's just shocking. It's really, really shocking. So I think we all are going to have to strategize.
We come from the US, New Zealand, and Norway, but many of you come from Japan or are in Japan. So if someone in the audience would want to tell a little bit about how it looks from Japanese side, it would be wonderful. For me, it looks like Trump is a kind of school shooter, comes in with an automatic gun and shoots at Panama, Greenland, Mexico, Canada, China, but not yet Japan. Japan is waiting for your Prime Minister to meet him. Please tell if you have stories to tell about Japanese attitude.
Thank you, Stein. Does anybody want to take up that challenge? I'm sorry, did you want to give us your perspective from Japan?
About the U.S.?
About how Trump is affecting Japan, what it will mean?
Nothing. I mean, nothing's going on right now in Japan, right? We're just waiting to see what Trump's America does to Japan. The thing is, I mean, for the Japanese political elites, businesses, etc., the United States is paramount. We have to remain friendly.
Yeah.
We're dependent on the United States, not only for investment and trade, but security. We're completely dependent, although we're trying to get out of it slowly, but we're dependent completely. After World War II, Japan just opted out of the international politics. Said that's a system of war, we don't want anything to do with it. And then we relied on the United States to keep the bases, military bases in Japan. At first, not promising to protect Japan, but later they do. But Japanese military had nothing to do with defense of Japan. It was relying on the United States to defend Japan. That mentality and structure is still in place. And so that Japan can only hope that one can wiggle out of whatever terrible circumstance or situation or is thrown towards Japan from Washington. Now, I have now, is that all right? Did that sort of...
Fine. Well, we can have other comments as well. I mean, is your Prime Minister going to capitulate if Trump says, we want you to double your defense expenditure?
Well, they'll nod and say, we'll try. And the question is like, in the press in Japan, they're saying, is he even going to mention Nippon Steel?
Yeah.
Right? If the Prime Minister mentions that, will that offend Trump? Yeah. And in that case, perhaps just leave it aside. Just don't bring it up.
Okay.
It's that kind of mentality.
Your question then?
A question. It's about peace in East Asia, reassurance. Taiwan and South China Sea are the two issues that are constantly mentioned. But I don't think those are the issues. The issue is US-China rivalry. The US looks at China as a peer competitor now and is determined, absolutely determined to knock it down. Just like after 1945, the United States wanted and actually accomplished, really, to be the most powerful military in the world, stronger than the rest of the world combined. In that same kind of logic, it's going to beat China down. I think it's completely, determined to do that. Last time the US identified a peer competitor in that sense was Japan in the 1980s. And then the US put a lot of pressure on Japan, Plaza Accords, et cetera, Japan just backed down, and the economy has been in ruins since. China is not going to back down. It's not. So, in that competition between US and China, what is the room, where is the room, or what is the reassurance that can be made?
I agree with you that the great game is between the US and China. And we are organizing a small workshop in the next few days to discuss exactly the question that you are asking. I agree with almost all you said, but I'm not so sure about Trump, because I don't see him as a strategist. And I don't know that he has these great designs to knock down China. There has been a strong intellectual tendency among hardliners in the United States, and many of his advisors that he has chosen are the people who really want to take China. And it could be done with economic means, but it must be backed up with military power. But that's not Trump's business. So we have not yet seen what he does with China, except that we have seen that he invited Xi Jinping to his inauguration. He has also only imposed 10% extra tariffs in addition to what was before, and he did it carefully at the same time as he declared 25% on Mexico and Canada. So there is some kind of game here. So I will look forward, no, not look forward to, but I'm anxiously looking forward to seeing what he will do with his East Asian allies. Will he put pressure on South Korea and Japan to have to arm more, or to double their defense budgets, and to pay for American troops and so on, and then threaten with withdrawal, that would of course play into China's hands. In a way, because you have this Trump at the top, I think that China and Xi Jinping have their greatest chance ever in history to play a constructive role on the global scene and make friends with all those who are harmed by US policies. So Trump is playing into the hands of China if China is able to pick it up. But the Chinese political system is probably not able to pick it up, but might be tempted instead to use a vacuum power to push forward instead, so that you get a more expansionist China in a situation where the United States ends up in an internal chaos. Because Trump is not just attacking around the world, but he's attacking to great extent internally. Yes. So he's out there together with Elon Musk to destroy the federal state. So this may actually, I start thinking that this may be the end of US role as the greatest world power.
Other questions and comments? Yes.
I'm afraid that we are running out of time, but so I would like to
No, we have until 5:15.
That's
Plenty of
wonderful.
time.
So my name is Eiken Hayashim. Just a quick introduction about myself. I've been working in academic institutions in the UK and the US, the media in China, both ruling party and opposing party in Japan, NGO in the UK, IT consulting in the US, now public relations in Japan. So currently I serve as the Secretary General of the research group on Japan's last 3 decades at the Japan Society for Public Relations Studies. I'm also visiting scholar at the Kyoto University and Hokkaido University and serves as an advisor to the bipartisan study groups now. So based on the cross-sectional experience of mine, I'd like to raise 2 points for our discussion on Trump 2.0. Are we oversimplifying the current situation by framing it merely as a populism? And when we look at the distrust in mainstream media and the disconnect between expert analysis and public opinion, isn't there more structural issue at play? The key challenge we face isn't just about populist appeal. It's about fundamental disconnect between institutional frameworks and public reality, I suppose. And how can we address this structural gap without falling into the trap of easier dismissing public sentiment or simply appealing to it? So that's my question.
Thank you. Stein, do you want to have a go at that? And what about you?
I think I couldn't quite hear it all, but I think I understood, and you can tell me if I didn't. But what I understood is that you're saying there's some real structural issues at play. Certainly in the US, I couldn't agree with you more, that our democracy is not working well. And I think Trump's appeal was that those who have not been doing well in the economy, they believed his promises, even if his fiscal policies are only going to benefit the wealthy. But there's plenty that's very wrong structurally with the US, and that's been a long time growing. So I agree with you. It's not just about a populist leader. It was a populist leader who could appeal to very real grievances. And I do think in the US and probably in other parts of the world as well, we have to address those structural issues, that democracy is not functioning well, that wealth gap is just growing everywhere. So those are real challenges. Did I understand? Did I respond to your question?
Yes, that's quite right.
Okay.
Stein, do you want to make a comment?
I can if you want. Yes. I agree that we should not think only about Trump, but also about longer-term trends. And there are several trends in addition to those that Olivia mentioned. One is what we have talked about, growing animosity between China and the United States. That has been a trend. Another trend is the growing role of social media vis-à-vis mainstream media, as you said. And this is part of explanation for the Trump phenomenon and can also explain many other phenomena. And then there is this role of digital technology, which is just growing and it becoming perhaps the key issue in the rivalry between China and the United States. And it's also in that sphere of digital technology that you have all the biggest fortunes and the rich oligarchs around Trump. And with somewhat similar situation in China, where the Communist Party rules over the oligarchs in China.
Okay, now if I could just make a very quick comment in response to your concern around populism. The MAGA movement, I think, was, in a way, a brilliant construction on the part of Trump and so forth. He played on people's grievances. He played on people's fears and anxieties. It was the politics of fear. The challenge I think he's going to face now is how to satisfy the grievances and fears that he aroused. And I think that's going to be a big challenge. We are actually exactly on 3:15, which is time for coffee and a break and a chance to chat with each other about these things. So thank you for a very productive first half of the afternoon. I'm sorry to intrude on your conversations, but we should try and keep time. So, because we only have until 5 o'clock in the room. We're very fortunate in the afternoon session to have 3 of our senior research fellows speaking. Keith Krause will be up first talking about peace in pieces, rebuilding global security architecture. Lisa Schirch is going to be talking to us about designing a digital public square to defend democracy. And Janani Vivekananda, who is a new senior research fellow at TODA, will be talking about opportunities for peace in a changing climate. And then we'll have some Q&A at the end of that as well. So thank you for your contributions to the conversation thus far. And Keith, I invite you now to share your thoughts on peace in pieces. That is PIECES.
Thank you for that, Kevin. And it is a pleasure to be here today, even though it's historically a very confusing moment. And I'm not so sure that I can shed much light or much more optimism on our conversation, given the comments that have been made before. I want to start by saying that The Economist magazine this week had a title or asked a question: is the post-1945 world order dead, and what might emerge to replace it? This is a question that many people are asking, and I think each day, as previous speakers have highlighted, brings some new and very confusing, I have to say, headlines. I limit myself to about 15 minutes a day of Trump world, because it's all I can take. Let me start by saying that my title, Peace in Pieces, has 2 quite different meanings, intentionally. The negative one is that the global hopes for peace are shattered, like a teacup broken into pieces, falling on the floor. Peace is in pieces. The less negative one, perhaps not totally optimistic, but at least a little bit, is that if we want to rebuild towards a more peaceful world order, and we're far from that today, we need to do so piece by piece. And I'll say a few words about that later, but starting with some very small steps and a long-term plan, and a realistic assessment of the strengths of the forces that are leading us to some very dark scenarios of war, violence, disorder, exclusion, and inequality. So we have to focus on building peace, one piece at a time, and I'll return to that in a couple of minutes. I want, in the next few minutes, to try and get just a little bit beyond the headlines, not to talk about Trump, although I'm happy to answer questions about current developments, but reflect on how we got here with a bit of a longer-term perspective on a few of the contemporary events. The highlights are quite depressing. We know from Kevin's presentation that the number of violent armed conflicts is at a level not seen since 1945. There are more than 55 ongoing armed conflicts, large and small, all corners of the world. This is higher than even at the last stages of the Cold War. It's not a particular coincidence that the number of conflicts has been growing or new ones have erupted. For example, the Tutsi-backed militia group in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, with the direct backing of Rwanda, is taking over major cities from the Congolese army. And Rwandan President Paul Kagame last week at least denied that his troops were involved, which is, of course, part of a strategy. And this occurs in a context of complete impunity. Everyone knows that the international community, or the UN, or any other organization, is unable or unwilling to act. And there will be more violent actors who take advantage of this particular vacuum. De-escalation in armed conflict has led to a dramatic increase in deaths in conflict, extremely high levels of forced displacement. From 2004 to 2006, which was the low point, that is to say, of deaths, so the optimistic point, there was about 27,000 people who died in armed conflicts per year. That figure has gone up more than 8 times, and deaths from interstate conflict exceeded 250,000 in 2021 and 2022. The global level of forced displacement has more than doubled, with more than 117 million people forced to flee their homes, which fuels not only a refugee crisis, but also some very intense debates around migration. And as we know, global military spending, as Kevin pointed out, is at an all-time high. Last December, Japan approved a 9.4% increase in its defense budget, which is the 11th year in a row in which Japanese military spending has continued. And the government, in justifying this, said that it's needed in order to meet the most severe and complex security environment since the end of World War II. And Japan is a leading example, but not the only one, of this turn towards greater self-reliance. And I'll say a bit more about that too. The list of other difficult situations beyond violent conflict is long. Rising authoritarianism, weakening democratic institutions, greater political polarization, and these points have been touched on by my colleagues. And they all fuel the global crisis of political legitimacy. So how did we arrive here? And what are some of the implications? I'm going to talk very briefly about two things. The first is the current and future state of the global peace and security architecture. And then the second is something that's just been touched upon briefly, which is what is the political economy or the economic underpinnings of this. No more facts and figures, though, I hope. Historically, after every major war and crisis, diplomats and leaders created some form of architecture to maintain peace and security. The first of these, as those of you who've done a little bit of international history will know, emerges in the 18th and 19th century and was the so-called balance of power, explicitly enshrined in treaties after the Spanish Succession War, after the Napoleonic Wars. And its main objective, probably its only objective, was to minimize the risk of major war between great powers and maintain the stability of the interstate system. It did not necessarily maintain the peace. It did not protect the interests of smaller states and powers that were often sacrificed through invasion or territorial dismemberment. It certainly did not protect the peoples within any of these states. And the story that we tell of the subsequent centuries is of the progressive development in the 19th and 20th centuries, moving beyond this crude global security architecture to manage relations between great powers through institutions, through diplomatic and more peaceful means, beginning with the Concert of Europe, moving through formal institutions such as the League of Nations, and of course, the United Nations. These all reflected several underlying ideas, one of which was how relations between states should be regulated, but another is what forms of domestic government are considered legitimate. Sometimes anything goes. More recently, democratic states were privileged. What kind of rights, if any, citizens had, and how the world economy should be managed. And these were interlinked. And I want to highlight that politics, economic, society, human rights, and global security are part of one package. They're not separate spheres. Now, we describe the post-45 world, or at least the post-Cold War world, as a liberal American-led world order, and in particular recently with a robust set of peace operations, post-conflict peace building, based on promotion of human rights, a willingness to intervene to protect the lives of civilians, and an emphasis on mediation and conflict resolution. All of this is off the table or disappearing very rapidly. We should, though, recognize that this 30-year period between roughly 1991 and today was, in some certain sense, a golden age, a very short-lived one, and perhaps a bit unique historically. It also, at least throughout the Cold War, before that, did not cover all parts of the world. So it takes a bit of historical amnesia to think that we have been living in a very peaceful world order for a very long time. In fact, prior to 1991, there were major wars throughout Africa, Southeast Asia, elsewhere that took millions and millions of lives. The reality of that was that there was a whole lot of violence, coercion, rule breaking by major powers, and the exclusion of whole swaths of the world's population from the benefits of the so-called cold or long peace. So we may be moving back, but we're not moving to somewhere that we haven't been before. And I think we need to recognize that. We may be witnessing a return to a situation of naked geopolitics, where only the interests of great powers matter, to echo Thucydides, where the strong do what they wish and the weak endure what they must. And the only thing that the global peace architecture will do moving forward is reduce the risk of major war, between Russia, China, the US, and any other state that can make a claim to being a great power, as Japan did in 1905 when it was admitted to the Club of Great Powers, and may once again, or any state that proliferates weapons, nuclear or conventional. And we may have minimalist measures for risk reduction, reassurance, and stabilization, because we've abandoned pretty much the entire dense network of arms control agreements and stabilization measures that governed the Cold War period. So this is actually a very bleak picture, but again, it's not a new picture. And I think we can draw some lessons from that. Second thing I want to spend the last 4 or 5 minutes on is talking about one other aspect of the liberal order that has only been mentioned very briefly by Olivia and a couple of others, which was the stable framework for tremendous economic growth and increases in well-being that was put in place after 1945. Part of the Japanese economic miracle from until the mid-1970s, part of what the French called les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years. And this took place, again, against the backdrop of American political and economic hegemony and governance of the world economy. I want to underline that the peace and security architecture is not separate from the global economy. And what has happened in the last 3 or 4 decades has been a radical undermining of some of the sources of distribution, regulation, and wealth through neoliberal economic globalization. It can be dated to the period of the 1980s. There have been tremendous gains for the very rich, but the bottom 90% of the world has 15% of the world's wealth, and the top 10% have 85% of it. And globalization over the past 3 decades has destroyed the balance between within states, between economic interest, states, and society. Hyperglobalization, as some people have called it, is undermining democracy. It's not an accident that people have no faith in democracy, because it isn't delivering the goods, which is not just about representing your voice on a particular issue you care about, but so-called bread and butter issues. And this is something that has fueled the populist rise in many countries, not just the United States. I could go on with the examples. They range from the wastelands in parts of northern Britain, some disenfranchised parts of eastern Germany and elsewhere. But I think we can argue, or at least we can note, that the economic issues are not just a domestic social and economic problem within particular states, because they undermine support for broader global efforts to promote peace and security, and they call into question any support for globalization to continue. It's created a polarized world of winners and losers, and it has political consequences. So if we, and this is a very long story that I made very short, but if we put it in this longer historical perspective, we can see this isn't about 1 or 2 leaders or 1 or 2 elections or Donald Trump, but what are the forces that gave rise to leaders like him and make them popular? He was voted into office. So to return to my question, what are the building blocks that we can use to reconstruct in the long run a more peaceful global, regional, national, and local world in the face of this crisis? I want to just return for 1 minute to the metaphor. Architects can design beautiful buildings and bridges and projects. Engineers are in charge of seeing what's realistic, keeping in line with the laws of physics and the properties of building materials. But the real heroes are the builders, the people who actually, brick by brick or beam by beam, build the bridges and houses and so forth. Rebuilding requires the efforts of builders, not just architects. And I think I want to take that metaphor seriously to say that we need to start very locally, in a certain sense, encouraging deglobalization, if you will. Not that that's not in the way that Donald Trump means it, but in at least promoting and refocusing attention on national and local contexts where people can build safer lives and resilient communities and capture some of the wealth that is being created and captured by global corporations, not just the big GAFAs or whatever they are, but the huge multinationals that are shifting profits and avoiding taxes around the world, and getting back some of the closer relations between state and society and the economy. We need also to build from the bottom up, supporting local peace-building initiatives within cities and communities. In the current context, this means local civil society organizations, faith-based organizations, grassroots, and subnational or regional initiatives that bring these groups together in coalitions, which must be greater than the sum of each of their individual issues. It's clear that one of the failures of the Democratic Party was to build a coalition that actually saw beyond the individual interests of any particular group that supported them, because as soon as the position of Kamala Harris deviated from what their interest was, they would say, I will not vote for her. And this is actually a crucial factor undermining democratic practice. So we need to build coalitions and alliances, and we need to be opportunistic. Cannot escape the chaos and the disorder that Kevin and others have traced, but we also can't afford to give up and retreat into political passivity. My conclusion is that if we turn our attention to the builders, turn very local, and become builders ourselves, not architects, not even maybe engineers, but that's where we can find and support and take advantage of the opportunities around the world that are not gaining great attention now, but that will help build, at least in some small way, pools of peace and peace in pieces. And hopefully we can build upwards from that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. Now we have Elisa Schirch.
Hello, everyone. It is good to be back here with you and see many familiar faces from the last few years. One of the things that I really appreciate about the Toda Peace Institute is bringing people together. Each one of us who's been talking today, we hold workshops where we gather people together physically, usually once a year, and then we meet on Zoom and we can do our work throughout the year. But we talked about how important it is not just to be on Zoom, but actually to be in the same room together. And as I'm going to be talking about technology, I just want to say it can't do everything. There's no replacement for being together in a space and seeing the humanity and feeling the presence of other people. And I think the first panel today, we are talking about really difficult times and issues. And I'm grateful for the Toda Peace Institute for creating a space where we can talk about the anxiety and the transitions that we are going through right now. My talk will be on designing a digital public square for democracy. Another thing you might notice is that all of us who are senior research fellows with the Toda Peace Institute, we work on different issues, but there's themes that are very similar. So I work on technology, but I'm thinking about how do we design technology to support democracy. And over the last few years, when I've been presenting in this forum, I've highlighted a lot of the problems, and today I'll try to give you some hope that there might be a better day ahead in terms of the impact of technology on our lives. Over the last year, we've been involved in talking with a lot of technology companies, both the big tech companies like Google, as well as small tech companies made up of people who are trying to develop what we call peace tech or democracy tech, really thinking about how do you design something to be more effective. And this metaphor of thinking about the internet as a digital public square has brought us together in terms of sort of thinking about how humanity throughout thousands of years have always found common spaces where we do market exchanges, we sell things, we buy things, we see each other in a social exchange, and we talk about political issues. And when the internet was being designed, I don't think people sort of really paid attention to how they were designing it and whether it would have good or bad influences on the market, the social, and the political exchange. But now, when we've seen how much harm can come from how we design technology, we're paying attention. How could it serve humanity to better far better than what it is today? How can it increase civic engagement, foster intergroup cohesion, and build public trust in institutions? Over the last few years, there's been a lot written about the very deceptive design practices of many of the big tech companies. Deceptive design, sometimes they're called dark patterns, really have manipulated user behavior. A lot of that has come about thinking about the impact of technology on children, the addiction of so many children to phones and to screens, and not being able to be in the same room without their devices with them. And so we really are thinking about how do we design technology so that it's not about manipulation, endless advertisements, or scrolling. You may know the study that was done at Facebook internally, and then it was leaked to the press, about how the algorithm at Meta, both for Facebook, Instagram, the other products that Meta owns, were rewarding anger and outrage. And so as we think about designing a new digital public square, how do we incentivize and create algorithms and designs that help us be good to each other, that help us understand each other, and listen to each other? This slide sort of shows a formulation that many of my colleagues and I have been working on. And the idea is that most of the tech regulation, and this is coming mostly out of the European Union, has focused on content moderation, that is removing the content that is harmful on the internet, which we think now has been really a distraction from the design issues. Digital harms, we think, largely arise from platform design, and we should be thinking about tech regulation focused on design and algorithms rather than the content. Because what we see now is that the platform designs incentivize and reward harmful, polarizing, deceptive content. The algorithms amplify that material. That has been proven a number of times. Actually, European political parties have said they post an ad on Facebook, and if it's not angry, if it's not deceptive, the algorithm doesn't pick it up. And so we see this now with the election in the United States, that the most polarizing, outrageous statements get the most traction on social media. So very much the election of Trump, I think, can be traced back to the design of our social media algorithms and the designs and how that has perverted American society over the last 10 years. So we're looking at different elements of design. When you're designing a platform, what does the design allow you to do? What does it prevent you from doing? What does it persuade you to do? What the design's algorithms amplify and highlight, and what the design manipulates or deceives you to do. So we're sort of really paying attention to each of these questions in the design of platforms. My colleagues who work at the Pro-Social Design Network have developed an inventory or a library of pro-social tech designs. So this is just a screenshot from their website. They work with university researchers who test different ways of designing platforms. So a reminder of norms, for example, the second one over. When platforms post how to be pro-social, how to be kind to each other, when they are reminding users to do that, which it's very easy to do, people are nicer to each other. So we know that you can design a platform and encourage people to be kind to each other, to listen to each other, and that works. So we have to ask ourselves, why aren't the big platforms doing that for us? We also have recognized that venture capital, especially in Silicon Valley, but also in other regions of the world, have not been able to reward pro-social designs of products. They haven't been able to calculate what is the harm from anti-social designs and what is the benefit, even the financial benefit of pro-social designs. So we've studied over the last year, what are those market forces? How are they impacting tech design? And as we gathered venture capitalists and policymakers together over the last year, we've asked sort of what do they need in order to be able to create the market forces or support market forces with pro-social design. And they have told us a number of things. They've said they need guides for pro-social design. So that's where we work with the Pro-Social Design Network. They need metrics for pro-social impact. I have a policy brief with the Toda Peace Institute that will be coming out in a month or two on metrics for pro-social impact so that venture capitalists will be able to measure whether a platform contributes to the common good, the social good. We also need the metrics for the financial costs of negative externalities like polarization, like undermining elections. How do we count that? How do we measure it? And we need better incentives for pro-social investment. And venture capitalist fund managers have told us they need public recognition and rewards for investing in pro-social technology. We need prizes to be given. We need to have recognition for these kinds of pro-social impacts. When we were in Europe earlier this fall, or last fall in Brussels and Florence, talking to tech regulators and policymakers, they sort of pointed out the overwhelming number of issues of the challenges of tech governance and why it's so difficult when government hasn't really been set up to regulate this new field of technology, which is so diverse. Technology is undergoing rapid innovation. There's the jurisdiction for Meta is in the United States, but it's impacting Europe and Asia and many other places. So it's hard for governments to regulate a technology that's not based in their own shores. The big tech has huge amounts of lobbying and control. So there's all these difficult issues of why it's been so difficult to regulate technology. One of the things that we've come upon is that we need to enforce auditable minimum design standards. So technologists have started outlining what would design look like if you were designing for safety or designing for privacy. I'll talk in a minute about data portability and interoperability, but you get the sense that, yeah, there's people working on what minimum standards should be. So just as you build a house and there are minimum standards for what is a safe house or what is a fireproof house, we need these kinds of minimum standards for building technology. We need reward structures for different standards. So I talked about sort of the minimum standards, but we know in the United States we have something called a LEED standard for building. When a building is built with sustainable materials, when it has a zero impact on carbon emissions, it's called a LEED standard. It's the highest level of building. And we also need to be able to recognize and put a stamp on technology that is built for these pro-social impacts. We have been asking regulators to demand platform transparency, so we know that what their algorithms are doing to us, what they're prioritizing. We already know that Elon Musk has switched the algorithm at X to amplify conservative and also Russian sources, and to almost completely dial back democratic sources. So it's a form of content moderation, actually. The algorithm shows you some things and hides other things. We've talked about improving metrics. Let me move on just because I have only a few more minutes. I think part of the challenge is we have assumed that big tech is here to stay. Meta, X, TikTok. And I think we're coming to the place where many of us think they are not going to be redeemable. They do not want to change. They are making billions of dollars off of us, and we need to migrate to other platforms. So just in the last few months, you've seen a new platform called Blue Sky go, millions of people joining it. And Blue Sky is interesting because well, I'll talk about it in a minute, but in order for us to migrate, we need to have more innovation. So actually, what is happening now is there's a monopoly on these platforms. You cannot take your profile with you or your network. You're kind of stuck. And so this has made it very difficult, and why we need more anti-monopoly laws so that there will be more innovation, more platforms developed. And these new platforms need to have data portability and interoperability. And so this is what Blue Sky is promising, that if you come to Blue Sky, you'll be able to bring your networks from other places. It's not in place yet, but this is the idea of having an open source network so that you will never be locked into, all my friends are on this platform and I'm stuck there now. I talked about that. Let me move on the last few minutes here. So we're basically working toward moving from big tech monopolies to a shared digital commons that is really being designed for social cohesion, for democracy, for being good to each other and kind to each other. That is not my slide. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa. Janani, moving back to another sort of gloomy area, climate change, and
I was hopeful.
yes.
Okay, I thank you very much, and it's such a pleasure to be here. I am. This is my first, I guess, formal opportunity to speak as a TODA Senior Research Fellow, and it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here. I do, though, have the special honor of being the last speaker on the back of quite some incredibly insightful and informative, but I must say rather anxiety-increasing presentation. So I will try my best to offer some, maybe, I mean, it's about climate change and conflict, so I may be limited in how much I can achieve this, but I will try my best to bring some hope to this conversation. I promise, though, that I will not make any references to US, its current leader, and I will try to reflect on some of the things that we can do as people in this room, as the research community, as a policy community, and even as individuals, so that we don't leave the room feeling really quite disempowered, or feel more empowered than we did when we came in, I hope. Oh, is that my first slide? Okay, so 2024, if we look backwards, it did present us with unprecedented levels of climate impact, and at the same time, we saw more war than ever before in the post-World War II era. But that said, if we recognize the links between climate change, peace, and conflict, this actually offers an incredible opportunity, because the impact of climate change and conflict, this isn't just a correlation. It's not just that these two things are happening at the same time. They're interrelated, and they're also mutually reinforcing. So if we understand these linkages, how climate change impacts compound the drivers of conflict, and how conflict makes it much harder to address climate impacts, we can get a much better insight into what to do about this. The flip side, of course, of this mutual reinforcing nature of climate and conflict is that peace interventions and sustainable development and sustainable environmental practices are thus also mutually reinforcing. So this really gives us an opportunity, a very clear opportunity for building peace. So I'd like to talk to you today about how building climate resilience actually presents this opportunity for building peace. And I'll do so by first setting out some of the pathways through which climate change affects conflict. And then I'll share some thoughts about what we can do about these. But to start with, this is not the order of my slides, but okay. Okay, there we go. To start with, why are we talking about this? When we look at climate change impacts, we know that climate impacts are global, but these impacts are not affecting everybody equally. They're if we look at not just the impact of climate change, but people's vulnerability to climate impacts. If we ranked these countries and we took the top quartile, we'll find that the most vulnerable, the 70 most vulnerable countries are also in the top quartile of most fragile countries. So these communities are not just facing climate impacts, but they're also facing this double vulnerability of climate change and conflict. Here's another view. So of all the countries receiving UN peacebuilding funding, so I'm using UN peacebuilding funding as a very loose proxy for fragility. I don't know how well you can see this, but essentially, we can see that almost all of these are highly sensitive to climate change. So they're in red and orange. Very few are green. Green means not so affected by these climate impacts. So this slide is mapping climate vulnerability of countries facing conflict, fragility, and political instability, and almost all of them are highly vulnerable to both. I chose this metric of financing, of peace financing, because we're in a world now where we have less money to do a lot more. There's more and more crises, and it's really helpful to follow the money. And if we follow the money, just looking at where peace building, where stabilization and conflict response money is going, they're basically going to places which are already climate vulnerable. So when it comes to peace building and stabilization operations, if you're a donor, you literally can't afford to ignore climate change in these contexts, because it's so much a part of the context, it's part of the problem. Ignoring it would not make for any kind of sustainable peace. So what do we do about this? It's really helpful then to understand how climate change affects the peace, how it can compound conflict and it can hinder peace, because if we understand this, we can try to redress it. Before I go into the pathways, it's worth noting that these risks that climate change poses to peace and security are not hypothetical. They're not just academic risks. They're not just risks for the future. They're current. They're already playing out. They're based on a lot of evidence. And it's not simply something for the future. It's really important to be thinking about this now, to understand these impacts now, to be able to anticipate them so that we can build this into conflict prevention measures and sustainable development measures, to be able to do no harm, to make sure our climate action and development and humanitarian efforts, but also peace building and stabilization, does no harm to inadvertently increase climate resilience risks or increase the risk of conflict, to prevent these risks where possible, and when we don't get it right, to be able to respond when we're too late. So the first pathway is that climate impacts affects competition and conflict, can increase the risk of conflict over natural resources, things like land, water, forests. So the impacts of drought or intense rainfall, etc., can alter access to and availability of these natural resources, which are particularly sensitive to any kind of changes in temperature or precipitation linked to climate change. And this can fuel competition and tensions and can contribute to violence if, and it's a very important if, natural resource and conflict management institutions don't work properly. And it's really important that we understand it's about the governance and the ability of these institutions to manage the variability and change which climate change is bringing about. I'd like to stress that it's not about shortage, it's not about scarcity per se. It's about where changes in climate change affect the access to resources which may have already been inequitable. For example, where climate change entrenches already unfair structures which granted access to grazing rights to one ethnic group over another, or access to a certain water point to one religious community over another. So it can really compound the structural unfairness. It can also compound the risk of violence when conflict perhaps has made traditional dispute resolution mechanisms no longer viable. And so this means that there's an increase in these disputes being resolved through violence when formal or informal mechanisms are no longer in place. The second pathway is that climate impacts can undermine livelihoods, and this can affect human mobility and in some cases push people into illegal coping mechanisms, things like criminality, organized crime, armed groups. Adverse climate impacts on jobs, particularly primary sector jobs like agriculture, fishing, things that depend on land and water, are especially susceptible. And this can, as people's ability to earn a living in these climate-affected livelihoods becomes more and more strained, people might look to move or look to alternatives. And when they move to places which are also resource scarce, or even if they're not resource scarce, but the host communities are not receptive to them, this can create tensions. We can see these kind of livelihoods and alternative negative coping mechanisms playing out in places like Afghanistan, where we're seeing an increase in farmers moving to opium production, or in Somalia, where there's more illegal charcoal production, or small-scale and artisanal mining in places like Sudan, which are actually very effective climate resilient livelihoods. However, are also degrading the environment by, chopping down trees and mining in ways that promote land degradation. So are in fact compounding the risks that people are looking to move away from. Gender norms play a role across all of these pathways that I'm talking about, but especially in this one: who migrates for work, who stays behind, also the role of masculinities as people's livelihoods are being affected. These can shape recruitment into armed groups, can shape people's vulnerabilities as they move and maybe living in informal settlements and being brought into criminal groups. And it's really important to look at all of this through a gender lens. The third pathway is about how climate change impacts can contribute to extreme food price spikes and food insecurity. Perhaps the most well-documented example of this is the climate-related violence, or the climate-related food insecurity around 2007 through to 2011. Climate change was a contributory factor here. And it contributed to rising food prices, which caused a lot of unrest and physical violence in countries around the world. And we see this at not just a state level, but also at very localized levels, as declining rural incomes affect poverty, affect vulnerability, really making these poorer communities much more susceptible to being kind of politicized by opposition parties or armed groups. And also really can fuel grievances against the current administrations who are not able to safeguard people's food security. So here you can see the pathway mapped out, the impacts of climate change on agriculture, decreasing the harvest and increasing prices, which then contributes to more food volatility of food price and food supply. And this is especially problematic in countries which are very dependent on imports, particularly when there's not a clear way of getting in enough foreign exchange to be able to buy food imports. And this really puts national governments under a lot of strain to be able to maintain food prices. And when they can't, when they remove subsidies, for example, we see a lot of political unrest, as we saw across the MENA region some years ago. The fourth pathway is around extreme weather events, and how this can really directly challenge government effectiveness and its legitimacy. Basically, the impacts of climate change can challenge governments if they fail, or they're seen to not meet the basic role of government, which is to safeguard the physical security of its people. If they can't meet the needs of people in the aftermath of a climate-related disaster, this can really undermine legitimacy. I'll say the flip side of this is that when a government is seen to effectively respond, a government or even a non-state, a non-government actor, we saw this in Aceh post-tsunami, when a non-state group is able to step up and really provide governance and address this in an equitable way, this can really legitimize an entity, and this can be both positive and negative. We're also seeing this in a lot of non-state armed actors in like the Lake Chad region, where we see Boko Haram and Islamic State West Africa Province offering basically disaster relief and climate loans for people to restart livelihoods, filling this governance vacuum and building people's resilience to climate risks, winning hearts and minds. So it's not ideological, but it's an opportunity for addressing some governance gaps by various actors. The final pathway is not to do with climate change, but our own actions. The unintended consequences of poorly designed climate responses can carry their own risks. So if they're not thinking about some of the specific contextual needs of communities and some of the knock-on consequences, if climate change is designed without thinking about how an intervention might benefit one community and not another community and create inequality between, for example, IDPs and the host communities by providing IDPs food aid and water and not the host communities, or even if peace building and stabilization efforts are not taking account of climate resilience and doing things in a very climate blind and environmentally insensitive way, this can also be very harmful and can carry their own risks, which can be destabilizing. I will skip this in the interest of time and then just finish up with some entry points, some opportunities. So understanding these pathways actually gives us the answers. It might seem quite depressing because there's pathways to all the bad stuff, but they also give us the entry points as to what to do to tackle these joint risks of climate change and conflict. It means that it shows us that by addressing some of these things jointly, they can really yield this double dividend of peace and climate resilience. And in a world where these resources are really being crunched, it makes business sense, essentially. It shows that you can do more with less. The argument to donors in this space is that if you make sure your climate action is conflict sensitive, you can ensure that it does no harm to conflict and can promote peace. If your peace building and stabilization is climate security risk informed, it can actually promote climate resilience. So you can really ensure that one of the few areas of international assistance that's still flowing and is unlikely to stop flowing in the next few years, even if I said I wouldn't mention this, okay. Even if certain countries pull out of the Paris Agreement, this will still continue, and the flow, it's one of the largest financial flows of aid to fragile states. This really carries a lot of opportunity to address peace through the climate finance aid architecture. So what I'd like to say, I don't want to generalize, because anybody that works on peace knows that there's very little that we can get from generalized responses, but I've been lucky enough to work on over 43 countries, and there are some broad principles that can be generalizable principles when it comes to how to effectively address climate security risks through a peace building and peace making lens. Essentially, this is about building community resilience to be able to better cope with variability. It's not about addressing specific climate impacts in a technical way. It's about understanding what makes people vulnerable or what reduces their resilience to these. It's often about a lack of social cohesion. It's about a lack of trust. It's about poverty. It's about marginalization. These are all the same drivers of conflict. So it's about understanding those root causes of vulnerability, which are essentially the same for both vulnerability to climate risk and vulnerability to conflict. And I'll just finish with 4 very quick steps that kind of illustrate this. One is around addressing governance issues and building social cohesion within climate resilience measures. Both inclusive and effective governance and social cohesion are really key to coping with shocks and stresses such as conflict and climate change. In addition, these can also mitigate factors that can drive conflict and the impacts of climate change. It's especially important for groups that were previously marginalized, and often these are the groups that are first to be drawn into kind of recruitment into armed groups or into criminality or into kind of support for opposition groups. And when they're included in decision-making over natural resource management, for example, this can really promote a strengthening of a social contract as well as building social cohesion between these communities, these marginalized communities and the rest. The second is around the need for and the value of better integrated analysis. So looking at climate change and conflict together. It's key to really properly understand and identify the specific ways in which climate risks play out in a specific context, really understanding the dynamics of a conflict at a very localized level, not overlaying a climate map and a conflict map and seeing where they kind of overlap and putting a red dot there, but rather looking at the interactions, who is affected and how. So really promoting integrated and contextualized climate fragility analysis. The third is around focusing on opportunities that already exist around natural resource management as an entry point to conflict and peace building. It's an existing enabling environment. Sometimes when all political avenues are shut down, climate and environment presents a space. It's often seen as a bit technical, a little bit apolitical. It's a shared enemy. It often leaves a space for dialogue and mediation between groups that wouldn't talk about grievances more directly. And the fourth and final one is around supporting sustainable livelihoods and livelihood diversification. Improving the sustainability of livelihoods and providing alternative forms of livelihood that are more climate resilient can be a really effective way of kind of bolstering people's climate resilience, but it can also address the economic drivers of conflict, as well as kind of promoting people's feeling of better being taken care of by local or national government, because their economic options are being addressed. So I just wanted to share these more practical examples. I know it's really bringing it down to a very granular level after the conversations we've had, but I hope that this leaves us feeling like there are some tangible things that can be done in this very constricted and challenging environment that we're facing. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janani. And now we have about 20 minutes to have a conversation about rebuilding global security architecture, beginning from the bottom upwards and outwards, taking advantage of different kinds of opportunities to rethink ways in which we can live more peaceful lives. We've got Lisa's concern around how do we create a digital public square to defend democracy, and Janani's just giving us this insight into ways in which we can begin making a difference around climate change, which is always important. So over to you for questions and comments. Ria.
Hello, thank you so much for the insightful presentations. I have a question for Janani. It's with regards to discourse on climate-induced non-economic losses and damages. You mentioned earlier in your presentation that one of the important conflict drivers that we have to be aware of is loss of social cohesion. So when there are climate-induced consequences that will force relocation, displacement, migration of a particular group of people, then naturally it is easy for them to lose their community, see their social cohesion destroyed, and as a result, that also leads to loss of cultural identity, indigenous traditional knowledge, no continuity in their and loss of ontological security. So there are many intangible losses and damages that are associated with people getting displaced or forced to relocate because of climate change. However, the discourse, on non-economic loss and damage and how they could be compensated is still very weak, I think, amongst the global policymakers. And I'm guessing it's because it's so difficult to quantify, right? Yeah, but we've been talking about this in Toda Peace Institute for years, but has there been any, since, Janani is, well connected to the policy world, has there been any progress in terms of supporting individuals, with regards to the loss of intangible assets?
That's a great question, Ria. I think you probably know the answer, but unfortunately, it's a very, very tiny part of the global discourse. I think it's incredibly important, and it comes up when the conversation and therefore the policy responses are locally informed, when they listen to those communities that are affected, and that this informs the policy position. But this isn't really the case. So often these policies are designed by technical folk, and this is one of the challenges of climate action, is that it is seen as very technical. Mitigating greenhouse gas emissions is done by climate change experts and climate modelers, and adaptation, how to help communities adapt to climate change, are done by kind of hydrometeorological or kind of soil experts, and these very technical climate experts who are not looking at things from a socio-cultural perspective often at all, and certainly not even from a conflict sensitivity perspective. I think another challenge is that a lot of this global policy has been largely informed by climate security research, even if it's localized, from a very different geographic context, from the African subcontinent. And there, the conversation isn't so much about relocation, and it's certainly not about the same kind of non-economic losses that are being faced by communities in the Asia Pacific, and particularly in the Pacific Islands. So there's a real gap in the knowledge base that is informing the policy positions. So I think the work that Toda is doing is really, really important, and it's important to make sure this is magnified and really feeding into these policy spaces, because really it's a tiny voice, and I've seen so little research on this. Yes, it's hard to quantify, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be discussed, and it isn't impossible. Right?
Other questions and comments? Yep, Joan.
It's not really a question, but I just wanted to thank all of you for giving hope. I feel much more hopeful. Of course, all the presentations have been excellent, but I think each of you has given the idea that, yes, at the local level, there are always possibilities. And I wonder if you could maybe each elaborate a little bit on ways of starting. I know, Lisa, your topic was maybe less accessible to all of us, but I think just this idea that these massive monopolies might crumble is very hopeful. So yeah, if each of you could maybe expand a little on sort of how at the local level people can see ways forward, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, should we do that in order? Lisa, you start first, and Keith, and finally Janani.
So I've been working with these small platforms called deliberative technology, Polis and Remesh. I mentioned it last year, and our Toda workshop this year brought together a group of about 50 peace builders to learn how to use these small platforms to foster dialogue. They've been using it in Israel-Palestine. I think I mentioned that last year when I was here. Well, then now they've had a full year of using Remesh among Israelis, among Palestinians, coming up with some common sets of principles for what a way forward is. We're working also in Afghanistan with these very small platforms that are really just showing us that it is possible. People who are at war with each other and really disagree with each other can talk to each other on these platforms if they are designed in a way to help people listen to each other. So I have a lot of hope. We definitely need several more years of developing these platforms, but there's just a lot of energy, especially in Europe, but also in other regions of the world. In Kenya, in Bangladesh, small tech companies are designing new platforms that are more culturally attuned and more pro-social, and that I think could point the way to a future. And if they're interoperable, you don't have to be a monopoly, you don't have to be huge. You can create a platform that will talk to people in other parts of the world that are on different platforms. So this is what we have to imagine 5 to 10 years from now, that we'll have a very different internet made up of a lot of small platforms that are more culturally sensitive, work in different languages, and are not run by American billionaires.
Thank you. Keith?
I want to elaborate a little bit on something I skipped over very, very quickly in the interest of time. And one of the points is that many of the conflicts that Kevin and I mentioned, 55 conflicts around, are actually relatively small and driven by local grievances, some of which are the things that Janani and others spoke about, Janani. And it would be important, I think, to encourage, therefore, what we know from the literature, which is local efforts among sometimes traditional leaders, sometimes faith-based groups, sometimes civil society organizations, to avoid the escalation of some of these conflicts, because they are mobilized, or the grievances are mobilized by political elites in a top-down fashion. So how do you create a kind of a fire break, if you will, or some kind of bulwark against top-down mobilization for their own interests of grievances that could be resolved at a local and community level? And we have evidence from places such as Indonesia or northern Nigeria, where the conflict did not spread, or where it did not break out, in part because of these kind of local efforts. So it's not just a plea to say, well, let's all be nice and local, but there is some evidence that can prevent escalation and what we would call instrumental top-down mobilization, because that's also what we see, in the United States, right? The mobilization of discontent by leaders for their own interests. So building from the bottom up is a way to somehow insulate a little bit against that. And I think that would be, often goes under the label of resilience, which is something we could spend a long time talking about, but I think is an important dimension. And it echoes very well some of the things you spoke about the adaptive strategies for coping with conflict. So I'm going to throw it to you.
Yeah, Janani, signs of hopefulness in climate change.
I think there, I was trying to think of a local level. We have not with TODA, but with my other hat, I manage a program called Weathering Risk. It's a flagship project on climate, peace, and security. And as part of that, there's something called the Peace Pillar, which looks at peace building activities happening in real time in about 5 different contexts, and how they can be more impactful through the integration of climate security risks in them. They operate at very different levels. One example that is very tangible is the work in Iraq. Iraq is incredibly climate affected, and it's also really struggling to kind of rebuild social and societal structures and institutions that people trust. And the work that's being done there is really small. It's not groundbreaking. It's provincial level dialogues with formal local leaders and that with communities. And it's essentially about the climate and environmental shocks that they're facing. And these dialogues are really just a space for discussion and and for information exchange, but we're finding that they're really promoting state-civilian relations. It's also bringing together kind of civil-military relations, because there's still a lot of kind of need for the police force and the armed forces to be trusted and accepted by a society that really doesn't have much hope in it. So the role of the military and the police in addressing some of these climate and environmental risks is actually giving them a kind of a civilian role, which helps build that trust. So there are these entry points. The larger scale opportunity I also want to flag is around climate financing, and I touched on this, and I think that there's a real acceptance by a number of the big climate donors that you cannot really get anywhere kind of pouring money into climate adaptation in countries that are already fragile unless you take account of the fragility. So there's a lot of movement on ensuring that enough of this climate finance does actually go to fragile states because they are the most affected. And so there is a space at the moment which I think we need to really maximize and take advantage of to ensure that climate finance is conflict sensitive, because there's a real opportunity to ensure that this is then going to ensure that every single dollar of climate finance is then at least going to do no harm to conflict dynamics, but where possible can actually promote peace.
Thank you. Yes, Tucker again, and then our colleague behind him.
Thank you very much. In the last session, I failed to introduce myself. I've been teaching international politics and peace research at Meiji Gakuin University. I am retired, but still have classes. Now, I have a problem trying to contextualize all these questions that pop up in my mind, listening to the intriguing remarks on the problems we face. So I don't know where to start, but the United States has a very situational force. If USA changes, world changes. It's a big country. And what I observe these 10 or more years is change in the society. Now you have the chairperson of the budget committee, the Bernie Sanders. He is a socialist, isn't he? And he clearly says that he's a democratic socialist. And young people accept that. So my question to Krause is, so what about the labor movement that has been in the developed world? Can they play a role? Because Stein was asking about what's going on in Japan. We have a big problem, which should be shared with New Zealand maybe. So in any time, there could be a big earthquake happening in Tokyo. So we have to be prepared, yes? But to be prepared, we need some kind of psychological, what's the word? Stepping up, foreseeing what's going to happen in some time. And that needs some kind of intellectual, what's the word for it? I'm trying to find a word for it. We need to innovate ourselves. We need to foresee problems that will be coming to us. Well, one is the natural disaster. Perhaps we can include climate change. Another is nuclear war. I mean, it could happen any time. Am I right? Yes. So let's be prepared for it. So how can we convince my students who are very much interested in very much concerned about what's going on in the world, and they want to know what can we do? Yes. So we adults have the responsibility to show. I don't know if maybe a pathway is a good word for not, maybe in a different context, but so can I ask just maybe it's a small question to Lisa. So the world of internet is really affecting our young generation. I mean, I'm screaming to my students, read books, but they go into internet, and they get tired by the time they need to read. So my small question is, how do they make money, these people who run the platform? Can we change that? Maybe I'm a Marxist. The way people gain money really matters. What's going on with those funders who are on the Democrat side? Were they oligarchs? Where is the money going now from them? I'm really mesmerized by what's going on. So please forgive me for being very confused, but I really appreciate your response, please. Thank you.
That's you then, Lisa.
That's a big question. So advertising is how they're making it. It's the most profitable industry in the world is social media companies. So Musk and Zuckerberg are the wealthiest men in the world because they have figured out how to extract data from all of the world's children who are on social media all the time. And then they sell this information to advertisers who target not only with products, but also with political messages. So this is the manipulation, the political manipulation of the youth also, which is very dangerous, obviously. So yeah, we need to change the profit model to say that you should not be able to extract data from people, and so privacy matters. And this is why the Europeans have passed these privacy regulations. Over the last week, we know that Musk basically went into several departments of the US government and extracted huge amounts of data. So this was not about cutting the budget for the United States. What Musk has just done is created a huge data bank of private information of taxpayers in the United States. So how do we get the public to understand that data it equals money, and that he has basically just robbed billions more? The wealthiest man in the world now has the access to manipulate even more people because of the private data that he's gathered. I don't have a full answer to that, but I do want to just say, because of the subtitle up here above me, it's all evolving very quickly, this profit model and how to monetize people's private data, surveillance capitalism. This is basically what is at the core of what Musk's strategy is in Washington.
Thank you. Keith, do you want to make any comments on that?
Not on the digital part, but on the first part of your question. I also didn't go through the long list of things that the neoliberal agenda has promoted, but obviously one of them was destruction of unions and the labor movement, deregulation, privatization, deregulation in all sectors, precarious work, weakening the social safety net, and reduced role of the state in any of these regulatory dimensions. And this is a 40-year project, so we're at the cutting edge of that, but there's nothing new. Elon Musk and others are just taking advantage of a set of forces that were put in place several decades ago. And that means it's going to take several decades to reverse it, which is the bad news. But it is reversible. I don't know what a young American means, and I'm not American, when they say they're a socialist. And I'm not sure Bernie Sanders is anything other than kind of a Labor Party center-left social democrat in European terms. So he can call himself what he wishes. But I think what animates people who label themselves is just a desire to reverse some of these forces, that not all regulation is bad. It's not socialist to say that, I don't think. Not all protection of workers' rights is bad. Not all provision of basic services and healthcare is bad. And that's, in the United States context, all of those things are called socialist today, or worse, communist. And yet, that's not the case in Japan, by the way, which still has a fairly resilient social safety net and healthcare systems and less polarization also as a result. So this is an interesting country in that context, and so too is Switzerland, which is where I live and work. So I think that recognizing that these labels, what's behind them, is really a cry to try and reverse a little bit of what's been happening for the last 40 years. And when you look at data on things such as youth unemployment or the impoverishment of youth who are employed, and how their low income, lack of ability to save, inability to afford decent housing, et cetera, et cetera. These are rampant problems throughout many of the Western developed countries. And of course, this will alienate them from the political system. We shouldn't expect otherwise. And of course, they will then look for some other kind of label to describe it. But how does that get mobilized into something practical, pragmatic, and realistic? And I'm too old to answer that question. I think that the youth themselves are going to have to answer that one.
Janani, do you want to make any comments about the youth? Okay, other questions and comments? Oh, sorry, yes, I forgot. Yeah.
So thank you for your insightful comments, obviously. And as a former advisor to Kraken, if you are familiar with, alongside with a Kyoto University professor from the Ministry of Finance and a prominent lawyer in the area, a Web3 company. I noticed, Lisa-san, with your point, I noticed your point focused mainly on the challenges with Web2, if I may. The problem lies in the centralized power, the data control over the user data. They monetize this data for their exclusive profit. Then platform power, unilateral account bans, content universal at will, and one-sided algorithm changes, and then also economic concentration, monopoly and only ad revenue and platform user-generated content, and arbitrary platform fees, for example. Given the Web2 challenges, how would you compare the centralization aspects of Web2 and Web3 blockchain-based system? If possible, if you can elaborate a little more. And then also, the second question would be also how do you see these decentralization system, which is Web3, I assume, applying to the decision-making process in other contexts?
These are very good questions. I think Web3 does have some possible solutions that we can be working with in terms of blockchain and more federated systems.
Can you say what Web3 is? For those that are not that tech savvy.
Yep.
So Web 1.0 was basically still one way. You could have a website, but it wasn't interactive. Web 2.0 was social media, where you can start posting and commenting, and it's going back and forth. Web 3.0 is a whole new kind of system of blockchain, where there's more ability to have privacy and breaking things down. And, we're still discussing, and the concern is the tech innovation sector still has the incentive to control it all. So we have to figure out how this next wave of innovation, how will it work? And we see it a little bit with AI, with the generation of different ability to put together large language models that can serve different purposes. How about I promise I will answer this question next year.
Any other final questions or comments? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for your presentations. My name is Nobiki Asai. I'm working for Sokaka International. My question is addressed to Lisa. So I was really excited with the idea of the pro-social technology market. But I was wondering how you or your colleagues are planning to monetize through the business, because you cannot monetize data, personal data, and so on. And also, apart from the social media domain, now, as you know, many new innovative ideas of taxation are emerging, like aviation tax or currency exchange tax and so on. So I wonder if you have any comment on those ideas.
All right. So yes, we've been researching different monetization models and whether there is a way to use advertising, but is not in this surveillance capitalist approach that Facebook has used. So for example, Maria Ressa with Rappler, they've just created Rappler Community. So Rappler is a Philippine news agency. They produce independent news. And she's just started a social media aspect to Rappler. It's called Rappler Communities, where she is still using advertising, but she has journalists doing fact checking. And so it's a different model where journalists have decided instead of trying to get their stories put on a social media network, they're going to actually host their own social media and allow people to have deliberation and dialogue about news stories on the news site itself with advertisement. This is the only real way I've seen a pro-social network being able to monetize. It's still relatively new, but Maria's hoping that this provides some way that other journalists might be able to sort of take control back so that you have fact-based journalism paired with a social network.
Great. Any other last final comments? We have to vacate the room at 5 o'clock. Well, if not, it gives me great pleasure to kind of thank all of our speakers, Stein and Olivia and Keith and Lisa and Janani. I think they've all shown you what a treasure trove we have in the Toda Peace Institute in terms of talented people within different thematic areas. I think all of us, to some extent, are leaning a little bit towards the pessimistic side of pessimism and optimism at the moment. But one of the things which we began to confront yesterday in the meeting was how do we maintain levels of hopefulness? How do we maintain a kind of courage to resist when resistance is needed? How can we learn from people like the Bishop of Washington how to talk truth to power? And most of all, how can we build solidarity between ourselves across countries, across cultures, and so forth, so that the United States and President Trump aren't able to dictate, how Japan should comport itself in the next 5 years, so that they can't determine how Australia will comport itself, or New Zealand, or any other country. And so for me, this is a sort of a moment when we're going to begin testing the utility of alliance and alliance relationships, and whether or not they're going to serve the purpose for which they were originally intended, namely guaranteeing the security and well-being of the peoples. From a New Zealand perspective, for example, we now have a whole unit reactivated in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs to monitor absolutely everything Donald Trump says over a 24-hour period, and to resist and to figure out ways in which we can resist it. And I'm sure other foreign ministries are doing exactly the same. So how do we work from where we are, which is the issue of locality? How do we kind of take account of all the different contexts that we're a part of? And most of all, how do we kind of not get overwhelmed by the flood of a negative opinion, which is flooding the airwaves at the moment? It's just too easy to be depressed. Keith is confining himself to 15 Trumpian minutes a day. Maybe that's an antidote, but more importantly, I think we have to kind of make sure that our social media, our traditional media, universities, and so forth, are all emboldened to do what they were developed to do, which is to kind of give individuals a chance to understand what is true about the world, what is false about the world, and to stand up to those that wish to impose their views on us, who have a dominatory view of power over rather than power with, and who at the moment are kind of generating much chaos. I keep on saying, when my father was dying, my daughter asked him what was the key to a happy life, and he said it was love. And so we need to kind of activate that in a way in terms of our relationships to make sure that our networks are strong and resilient. And we need to kind of cultivate courage, because courage itself is something which evaporates very readily in the face of opposition. And hopefulness is absolutely key to everything. And so those three commodities, I think, are also part of our nonviolent weapons in the struggle to kind of make sure that the world doesn't overwhelm us, and that we don't lapse into a global conflict in Northeast Asia, and that we start resolving the 56 different conflicts that are occurring around the world. And so it beholds me to also thank our Toda Peace Institute staff who put this all together, who managed to get the interpreters. Thank you to the interpreters for all your very good work. Thank you to those who are doing a video so that we can post it on social media and make sure that there's some countervailing pressure. And thanks to all of you for coming and spending your afternoon with us. That you've given us that most precious commodity of all your time. And I hope that you feel that your gift to us has been repaid with the messages you've heard. Great, thank you.
you.